Welcome to Merryfield's Gardening Advisor, brought to you by the experts at Merryfield Garden Center. Join us as we discover beautiful plants, new trends, and exciting ideas for your landscape. So let's get growing together. Merryfield's Gardening Advisor, bringing out the best in your garden.
Good morning, everybody. I'm David Yost. Thank you for joining us today. And with me on the show here is Karen Rexroad. So glad you could be here today.
Good to be here.
So a lot of you know Karen. She works in our perennial section primarily, but of course she can help you in any part of the garden center. It doesn't have to be just perennials. But Karen, this weather has been so phenomenal and beautiful. I know you said you've been spending some evenings out in your garden
What a
when you
summer,
get home
what
from
a
work.
summer. Yeah, August has been fabulous, absolutely fabulous, something that we're not used to. It's just so nice. I'm loving it. It's unusual. We'll take it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I know with Karen and I were talking that a lot of times, we're busy during the day, but in the evening you've been out there with a lot of night blooming flowers.
Yes, I have a garden all sort of designed around having fragrance at night and having moths at night and white flowers, and very, very fragrant.
Exactly. So we thought that would be an interesting thing to talk about in today's show, but we also, as we got in our conversations, we sort of expand this. I know we're both just kind of fascinated with the whole ecology of plants and how things work. So we're going to be talking a lot about flowers and their pollinators and really how fantastic this is and essential, and it really adds a whole nother dimension, I think, to our gardening experience.
Right, and it's fun to know a little bit so that you can aid them in your garden and bring them into your garden. Butterflies, hummingbirds, bees. It's all a lot of what, as gardeners, we like to do, because that's sort of part of the entertainment of the garden.
Right. So we're going to share a lot of that with you today. We are not going to be taking phone calls. Debbie went with her family down to the Watermelon Festival in Alabama. Didn't even know that existed, but that's a tradition that she's
So August would be the month for that.
Exactly. Diane's on vacation, so we don't have anybody answer the phones, but that's good. It gives us the full hour to share lots of great flowers and information about their pollinators. So just kind of kick off the conversation, I wanted to show a very simple flower coming up here, which is a mugo pine when it's in bloom. A lot of times we don't think of pine trees as flowering plants, but of course they are. But as a very simple flower structure, it's just not something that really draws the eye of the gardener.
Right.
But these are very primitive plants, and way back when plants were starting out, it's a good example of a plant that relies on wind pollination. You see the sort of yellow flowers there produce the pollen, and that pollen is just carried on the wind. And if you look real close, almost a little bit of a purplish tip there is the female flowers, and it just relies on wind to transfer and move that pollen over, which then of course develops into the cone that produces the seeds so that the plant continues to propagate itself. But as plants continue to evolve, this arrangement just got more and more elaborate, and sort of the next step, or a big leap forward, really is we're going to show this magnolia flower, where if you use your imagination, to me that still has some resemblance of that cone type of structure.
Right, but isn't it true if it's more bee pollinated, the pollen is heavy and it doesn't move? Like when you see the mugos, when they're really ripe, you see the pollen moving through the air with the gust of wind in spring.
Absolutely, gets all over the windshield of your car, and you'll see it out there.
That's all the wind moving pollen, yeah.
But here, as they evolved, and insects came into the scene, they kind of moved into that structure, like we see the magnolia, and it continues to develop from there.
Right, and with the honeybees, I was always curious if they were coming for nectar or pollen. I mean, it sounds like something simple, but I was confused. So they're coming for both. The pollen is the protein, the nectar is the sugar or the energy, or like caffeine for them. So that helps them along their busy day keep going, but they need both. So they're coming actually for both, intentionally.
Right, so the plants, they start developing these very elaborate systems to lure and draw them in with fragrance, with nectar, with beautiful colors. And I think a lot of times, as gardeners, we don't always think about it. We're just looking at the beautiful colors and how much we enjoy the flowers.
Right, and even every shape of a flower is designed for its pollinator. So once you start to pick up on that, then you understand, who you're luring into your garden, and maybe who you want to based on the shape of a flower, or even if it has fragrance, and definitely the color for sure.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating.
And I had to put the passion flower in there because as you're talking about these elaborate shapes and
Yes.
structures that show in there, I mean, this is just insanely elaborate. But this is, again, all developed. So when a bee comes in there, if a little bee comes in there, those that corona that's in there to sort of draw them in as they search for nectar. And while they're in there searching for the nectar, the pollen kind of gets scrubbed onto the back, and then they sort of transfer that over to the next flower. And of course, for the plant, this is also, it can produce the seed and the fruit, and that's also what's so important to us in terms of our food chain as well. Yeah, so that's kind of what we're talking about today, but you know, we're not going to stick just to the science of it. We'll also talk about a lot of the plants and flowers, so we get as much enjoyment as the bugs do out of it. Now, one thing I wanted to say before we jump into that full with both feet is to put a word out for the Fairfax County Master Gardeners. Now, Master Gardeners is a national, even international organization, but it's a volunteer program. It's where people who love gardening and want to improve their communities through gardening can volunteer through the extension program. So what happens is the extension program through the universities provides education and training, and then as volunteers, Master Gardener volunteers, we take that information forward out in the community and try to build and develop our communities. I'm going to say it's kind of state by state. It also is county by county. So the program that I've been a member of for years and that I'm associated with is for Fairfax County residents. So I know we reached, you know, D.C., Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia. So you would need to contact your local county where you reside to get the details. But if you live in Fairfax County, we want you to go to that website, fairfaxmga.org, and you can get all the details. And if you're interested in becoming a Master Gardener, we'll tell you how to do that. And you can fill out the form online and get all the details there. Karen and I, we've known each other for years. I think this is officially how we met because I've recruited Karen to come teach the program.
Yeah, it's a great program. It's you know, anybody you talk to that's been through it generally just has this great love of it because you learn so much. There's so much to learn. So I'm definitely a big supporter of Master Gardeners every way I can.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a big pleasure. Karen and I work together now, but like I said, we started out knowing each other through Master Gardener, and as things evolve now we get to work together as well. So you meet great people. There's another benefit that goes there.
Yeah.
All right. So let's go back to pollination real quick with one more picture here before we take commercial break.
So this is Gara, which blooms pretty much all summer. Wonderful plant. A lot of different pollinators come to it, which include, you know, as you see here, a bumblebee, but honeybees go to it as well. And it's native from Virginia to Texas. It needs really good drainage. It tends to be, since it flowers so much, relatively short-lived, but it will seed and you'll get volunteers coming back. So, you know, you may have it in your garden for a couple years, but then you get these volunteers coming back, and the fact that it blooms all summer is what makes it so fabulous.
Yeah, and you see that bumblebee carrying that big pollen ball between his legs.
Yeah.
And of course they're gathering that up because, as Karen said, that's going to be the protein that they take back to the nest to
feed the babies,
to keep their babies going.
Yeah.
So it's just a phenomenal relationship, and we look forward to exploring that more, but we're going to take a quick break right now. We come back, got more interesting information, both flowers and the pollinators. Good morning, everybody. If you're just joining us, Karen and I are here today talking about pollinators, their importance in the ecology, their importance in gardening, and what we can do as gardeners to attract, appreciate, preserve, protect, promote, everything to get pollination going.
Right.
So we'll just go back to our pictures here for starters. Let's see, I think our first picture coming up is showing the honeybee. Of course, this is a bee that was introduced to this country because it does lend itself to cultivation and the collection of honey, but an extremely important pollinator for us as well. Yeah, so what you're seeing there, you know, the the bees, as Karen was saying, they're attracted both for nectar to feed on as well as pollen to give them the protein. And plants, they have these flowers to attract and bring them in. Now, one thing that happens, bees, they have a very short tongue on them. They're not able to reach really deep inside the flowers. So a lot of times when you see plants like this sedum, which are coming into bloom right now, are great for drawing these insects into the garden, and their flowers are open, the nectar is easy to access, and they're great for attracting bees. And we'll just continue to look at the next picture.
So this is just another bee, which shows you again that this is a bumblebee, of which we have quite a few native bumblebees in Virginia, but they also need that shallow, short flower in order to gain access with their short tongue. So you see them a lot on lavender. You also see a lot of the small sulfur butterflies on lavender. So lavender, you know, really attracts quite a few of the bees and the bumblebees with that short flower. And the color, they tend to like blue, purple, and yellow. So this is just another color that they're very much attracted to. It said they can't even see red, which is more of a hummingbird color.
And then we'll just continue looking at some of the adaptations plants have made to accommodate these pollinators.
Right. Sometimes it's not just a short flower, it's a flower that gives them a place to land. And I always laugh at what I call a non-skid surface for them to fly into and land in order to access the nectar and the pollen. And I have actually found bumblebees asleep inside there as they just sort of found that this was a nice place to take a nap
Yeah.
with that landing pad.
Well, it does look cozy.
Yes, it does.
It does. So a lot of times flowers, you know, they'll kind of encourage the bee to climb back in there to the back of the flower to get to the nectar, and in the meantime they're getting smothered with the pollen, and
Right.
and they become the transporters on that. And it's just really amazing how these plants have adapted to invite the pollinators in, and sort of the one extreme of that is when you start looking at orchids in the orchid family.
Right.
Some of these flowers actually start to mimic the insect themselves, and while that doesn't look anything at all like a bee to me, somewhere in here a lot of times they sort of lure them in hoping that the bees will come in there. They're searching for a mate. And as they do that, it's a little hard to see, but on that bee's leg is what's called a pollinia, where the pollen on orchids, it's so protected, it's almost like in this little saddle bag that gets stuck onto the bee's leg. So there's really no pollen or nectar available for this bee. He's going in there, he thinks he's found a date for the evening, but inadvertently he's actually just transporting the pollen around for the orchid. So these relationships just get more and more and more complex and more fascinating the more you start to look into them and lead to these great floral structures. The next one shows us sort of an example of sort of a composite flower, which is great for bringing pollinators around.
Right. Composite is any daisy, and they're designed to bloom later in the year and to attract everything from butterflies to numerous bees of various sizes. This is a metallic bee that's come to Silphium, and you can sort of see that, you know, their ability to collect and at the same time pollinate, because as they move around, they're moving pollen around. So this is one plant that attracts a great number of butterflies, as most composites and daisies do. When people come into Merrifield and they ask us, you know, we want a daisy, you know, my mind kind of reels because there's just so many, because they're all composites. We have many, and most of them are native.
Yeah, and we use that word composite because each one of those little flowers that you're seeing sticking up there is an individual flower,
yes,
but
yes.
clustered together like that, and like I said, a resting spot where the insects can land and they can feed at their
Right.
leisure, so that's always fantastic.
The petals are there just to lure them in, where all the business happens in the middle.
Yes, we've been talking about flowers that attract bees. Well, of course, butterflies are
Right.
the one that we all want to see, and so we've got some examples with that.
Right, and there's just another example of black swallowtail coming to echinacea, which is another composite, and they actually can access the nectar, which is what they're doing there by drinking it, but picking up pollen on their legs as they move from flower to flower.
And of course, everybody's favorite, the hummingbirds.
Right, and the hummingbirds, oh my gosh. So they move so fast, it's really hard to get a good photograph of them. But what you're really seeing is where the hummingbird, the flower is generally, their favorite is red, although they go to many colors. But this tubular shape is designed for them, and there's usually more nectar in these types of flowers, which is also designed for the hummingbird, which has such a high metabolic rate that it needs so much nectar. But inadvertently, as it's reaching in to sip the nectar, it's picking up pollen and dispersing it, where you see this stigma is hitting its head, but as it's moving in and out and picking up pollen on its beak, it's actually, delivering it to the flowers as it moves along, sipping nectar. So the plant, its reward, the nectar, is functioning also to spread the pollen and have it pollinated. So the hummingbirds like tubular flowers, they like bright colors. These are generally very high in nectar, which is what they need.
Right. Now, I know a lot of times people are concerned and alarmed about seeing bees in their garden. And here we are. We're trying to get the message out, saying, no, these are your friends.
They're not
these
after
are
you.
essential. We need to have those. Healthy gardens should have insects, lots of insects in there.
Yes, and you have to be careful about what pesticides you use. I mean, these guys are all, they have to have a pretty clean environment in order to survive. So we have to be careful about what we do when we use our pesticides in our garden.
Great. Well, we're going to take a quick commercial break. When we come back, I know Karen's got a few plants she wants to highlight to help invite and bring some of these friends into the garden. Thank you for joining us on Gardening Advisor, and we've been talking about great plants to bring hummingbirds and butterflies and bees to your garden. You brought some couple examples along.
I brought great stuff. So one of the plants that we are going to look at is the Agastache, which you see here. And it's, clearly, as I was saying, it's very tubular, it's very narrow, it's very long. It's a southwestern plant that's pollinated, the primary pollinators, the hummingbird. So it's very, very high in nectar. And the problem that we have, because they're southwestern, is that our soil's a little heavy for them. Our winters are, a little wetter than they like. So one of the things you should do when you plant them is put more rock or grit or something like that in the soil for good drainage. They bloom absolutely all summer. The treat for the hummingbird is like you're giving them, a treat every single day. So I find them very worthwhile. It depends on the winter as far as if we'll get them to winter over. But they're just wonderful plants, and they are the #1 hummingbird attracting plant. And if you do catch, and see some of the hummingbirds while you're visiting Merrifield, you'll see this is where they generally like to go. I mean, this is just very high nectar plant for them. And then another plant that I brought was this Acidanthera, which is one of the plants out of my night garden. And it's sold in the spring as a tender corm, so it's not hardy. But it's relatively inexpensive and very, very fragrant at night. So it blooms, if you get a great number of them, you'll have flowers all summer long. And it just smells delightful in the evening, and moths are what come to pollinate it, which is its intent. The moths are attracted to the color and to the fragrance. So a flower for the night fragrance is really full of white flowers, generally tubular or sometimes absolutely wide open like the moonvine, but big and large, very, very fragrant. So you get a lot of these great big wonderful moths coming at night. I was actually in my garden the other night and had a moth come and flap in my face. It was one of the big sphinx moths, and it was just flapping around in my face, and I just thought it was so cool. I was just giggling. It was so wonderful.
I know most people would be freaked out, but you were having fun with it.
I knew, it was just a harmless big moth, but it was just such a surprise, and I just was feeling it was just wonderful. I loved it.
Yeah, and I love doing his programs together. I've never grown that flower, but now that you've introduced me, I think it's on my wish list for next spring.
The fragrance is nice. It's a beautiful cut flower. It lasts in a vase a very long time. Blooms all summer if you get them in like May 1st or as soon as the soil warms up. So I do them every year.
Right. Now this next picture I think is interesting because we're talking about the flower shape and trying to draw hummingbirds in and so on, but things don't always go as planned.
Right, and this is a honeybee on the Agastache, and it's kind of obvious that there's no way that the honeybee is going to be able to fit down into that flower. So what it's doing is it's nectar thieving. It's coming along and it's just getting the nectar at the back of the flower, therefore not even pollinating the plant. And we see that so much because we have this sort of wrong bee or wrong flower, not native with native. And so you see a lot of this nectar thieving happening in the garden when the flower is too narrow for the insect to be able to get into it, to get it any other way. So they sort of pierce the back and steal the nectar, and we call them nectar thieves.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll just see what's next.
Oh, and the fig. You know, we've been talking about the fig and what is the fig fruit really? Where is the flower? And does it need pollinated? And it turns out that the figs we grow here are all female, so they don't need this very intricate pollination process that you'll read about sometimes where there's a wasp that has to go in and pollinate them. So David, you kind of had your thoughts on what kind of fruit this is, what you call this.
Oh, you're not going to put me on the spot like that.
No.
Good.
You called it like an inside-out strawberry.
Oh, yeah, my non-technical way of looking at exactly.
Yeah, we can stay there.
The name is about this long as far as what type of fruit it is. But yeah, I always visualize it as an inside-out strawberry. It's saying, you know, on the strawberry, how you get all the little seeds on the outside of the fruit as a swollen receptacle. On a fig, it's inside out, and all those little seeds on the interior, when crunching on each one of those is a little seed from an individual fruit that's developed inside the receptacle. So it's neat. Probably getting a little elaborate on figs, but it's actually the stem encloses the flower. The flower occurs inside that, and on those that require pollination, that little fig wasp has to crawl down inside that receptacle to do the pollination. But as Karen was saying, most of our common figs that we're growing don't have to go through that, because otherwise I'm not sure how well we do with them.
Well, and when you bite into them, I imagine we're sort of seeing all those little flowers because it looks like there's lots of little tubes.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating, very
It really
fascinating.
is. It is. And then this is all stuff that you can do in your garden and enjoy and get the kids involved with it too. And now the common violet is also pretty elaborate in how it goes about its reproduction.
Right. We get the viola flowering, and we're familiar with that. But in the summer, if you find, and they can be quite rambunctious and weedy, if you find them in your garden and you go to pull them up, sometimes you'll find all these seed pods at the base, but you never really had flowers. And that's called a cleistogamous flower, where they didn't even need to produce the flower. They actually were able to pollinate themselves underground. And what is actually produced are seeds that are the exact replica of the parent. Now, having said that, being that they tend to reseed all over your garden, and they have these two different ways of actually seeding, the real flower versus this one. You do, if you're inclined to weed them out of your garden, I would say don't weed them all, because the great spangled fritillary butterfly uses this as a larval source, so you do need to use some, leave some in the garden for them to feed on. And the great spangled fritillary is a butterfly we see quite often in our area because we have so many native violets.
Right, now we've been talking about butterflies and bees, but there are actually more moths than there are butterflies.
Which I did not know. That's fascinating.
It is. Well, it's because most of us are asleep at night. We're not out there seeing what's going on.
Except for this guy.
Exactly. So here we've got the hawk moth or hummingbird moth that's there, and you can see its ability to hover there. And if you look real close, you can see that long mouth part, that proboscis, that's able to reach down deep inside the tubular flowers to reach the nectar. But we wanted to kind of talk a little bit about what does go on at night in your garden.
Right, and this is one of my favorite plants, the Nkosi. Flowering tobacco is a common name. We actually had some of these wonderful plants for sale at Merrifield this spring, which it's not a plant you find very often. The flowers are there during the day, but not quite as open. And then they sort of move and become more upright during the evening hours, and then the fragrance is emitted during the night. And you get, all kinds of moths coming to them, again, with that long proboscis to reach into the nectar deep inside the flower. And the fragrance is just astonishing. It's just an amazing plant that can take quite a bit of partial sun or even maybe light shade.
Yeah, and that is an annual, right?
Yes,
Exactly.
it recedes for you though.
Great. Again, we're going to take a little commercial break. We'll talk about the tuberose when we come back. So that's just a teaser
Yes.
for what's coming up next. Welcome back, everybody. We were just talking about the night garden and
Right.
flowers that bloom at night and put out fragrance, attract moths,
And this
bats,
August,
and
this August has been like one I don't even ever remember. I mean, it's just, I guess the cool nights have triggered more flowers. I don't know. It's just been wonderful. So one of the ones I wanted to show everybody is the tuberose. And the tuberose, if I had only one, it would be this one. It's not hardy. It is indeed a tuber. You can buy them in the spring, and you don't put them out till the soil is warm, which might be, beginning of May, middle of May. But the fragrance is just crazy, and it comes in a double, it comes in a single. The single is my favorite. You do need to lift them in the fall if you want to save them, which it is worthwhile because they're not as inexpensive as the Acidanthera. But my, oh my, the fragrance is just absolutely, just remarkable. And these have been in bloom in my garden now for the past month, and I just it's so exciting that when you smell these, the fragrance actually just sort of stays with you. It's a very, very kind of cloying, heavy, but sweet and delightful fragrance. Really special.
Now, will that bloom sort of late afternoon, or is it really just
No, it's
into
open, and it actually has fragrance during the day too.
Oh, okay.
But
Oh,
more so at
fantastic.
night. You really have to try to make a point of going out into the night garden when you have them, because it's just the best. It's the best. Tuberoses are the best.
Okay. And we'll just keep going through the pictures here.
And here's the Acidanthera again, and it's tender, just like the tuberose is. So it's something that you want to buy early, but not maybe put out till the soil is warm. But because it's so inexpensive, it's not such a big deal that you might want to have to feel that you would need to save them all. And it is, as you see, a great cut flower. I do love to cut them and bring them in, and they last a long time in a vase and bloom, on and on up the stem. So they're great for using this way.
All right. And we're just going to keep looking at the things that are going on at night.
Yeah, the moon vine is an enormous vine, and it grows like to unbelievable proportions in one summer. The flowers start as the days start to shorten, so we've seen the flowers opening now, and they're about 5 inches across, very, very light, lemony fragrance at night. But the moths just love to come to them, and it's just a real treat when as we move into fall and the days get shorter, we're going to see a lot more flowers on the vines themselves. It is a tender or an annual vine for us, so you buy it in the spring and you put it out when it's really warm. It can't even take 40s, it doesn't even want 50s. Like the dead of winter for this vine would be 55 degrees. So you want to get them out once we see the temperatures have risen above 55 degrees at night in the spring, and then once you do, it's just an amazing thing to watch grow because it grows seemingly, inches a day.
And that's when, of course, you can sit there and you can actually watch the flower unfurl.
Yes,
which
you
I don't
can.
care how young or old you are. That's just fascinating.
That's
to sit
right.
there and watch that bud just sort of spin open as it starts to develop. And we've got a few others.
And this is a Datura. And Datura is different than Brugmansia, the angel trumpets, because it holds its flowers upright. Now this variety is easy from seed, and if you have it in your garden, then you almost can't help but have seed pods and subsequent seedlings. So, some people almost think of it as a perennial because it's so, it's there every year because it's seeding and volunteering itself. The fragrance at night is very, again, light, almost like the moon vine and lemony. The flowers are large, and you do get lots and lots of different pollinators coming to it. Initially, as it's just opening, you'll still see the honeybees are out, but you get those great big night moths coming to this one, where they'll actually just go, the flowers are deep, and they'll go right into the flower and almost disappear, and then flap around and leave again. And this was a treat. We had this at Merrifield during the spring. We had the double purple and the double white, which is very interesting, and it makes a seed pod, and if you collect the seed pods, the flowers come true from seed. So you really, if you buy this double variety, then you can grow it yourself again the next year and get the same doubleness. And it's kind of interesting that it's fertile, because so often these really double flowers are infertile. But I should say, and I think it's important to tell people, Tora, Brugmansia, angel trumpets are very poisonous plants. And so you sort of have to keep that in mind. Mine are up in raised beds. I've never had a problem with anything, but they are along the lines of say, even more poisonous than poinsettia. So you need to know that if you have small children around, or maybe pets that chew. And this is Brugmansia. So you see the difference between the Datura was sort of holding its flower upright. The Brugmansia holds it down. Those petal tips, those long points to those petals, the breeders actually call those teeth, and they breed for these to have longer teeth. They actually call them long of tooth when they're good. But Frosty Pink was one that I picked up at Merrifield this spring along with some others. And I wintered it over last winter. It grows into almost a large shrub, small tree. Dug it up, potted it, and kept it in a relatively low light place during the winter. Now that I have it my second year, the other night I think I had 100 flowers on it. And it was just absolutely spectacular. The night moths go up into those flowers, and it's just blooming and blooming and blooming, and there just seems no end in sight for what I see for buds that it's developing. So it's nice if you can save them and keep them a second year, because they get, I mean, it's every bit of 5 feet tall by maybe 7 feet wide this year. It's just beautiful.
That does look spectacular. Now, Karen, several times you've mentioned, well, you picked this up this spring, you picked this up this spring. I feel like we need to say a word about availability on some of these really neat plants that you're showing us.
Right. I mean, you're not going to go find now, and you're not going to find some of these bulbs now. We just did sell out, though, of the Brugmansias. We did have them for quite a while in the summer. So, you know, it's something you think about early in the year, and then you plant them early, and you have them for the summer months. And August is the best month of the entire year.
Exactly. So we're always planning ahead.
Yes.
Great. Well, we're going to take a little commercial break, but stay with us. We'll be right back with more great plants for your garden and great plants for pollinators. Isn't that peacock pretty?
Yes.
Exactly. Yeah. We did our own set decorating today, so I get a lot of pleasure when I see my little things I pick out in there.
We all need more peacocks in our garden.
Yeah. Do we? I just have the little accent there. I'll skip the real thing.
Yeah. Okay.
They're messy.
Oh, I haven't. I have chickens and guineas. I don't have any.
Oh, you don't want peacocks.
Okay.
They're noisy. They're messy.
Huh.
I used to have a neighbor, they'd sit on the roof and poop everywhere.
Oh.
Yeah. Anyway, they're pretty to look at. Anyway, so we're talking about butterflies, though. Everybody wants butterflies.
Yes.
We may not agree on peacocks, but butterflies we do.
Yes.
So we're going to sort of devote this segment. We've been talking about pollinators, but specifically to butterflies and moths, because everybody loves those. And they're a good example of, in the insect world, we call a complete metamorphosis. And what they'll do, this is a series of pictures sort of showing all 4 stages of development. And down that Japanese maple, you can see those are actually the eggs. Now this is one of the giant silk moths, so that has relatively large eggs. You're not going to find many butterflies that lay eggs that size. But they go from an egg, and then that egg hatches out into the larval stage, which is the caterpillar. And in this case, this is a Cecropia moth, and up in the top, that's the larvae that's feeding on a willow tree. And we're talking about flowers, but we're going to change that conversation a little bit, saying, hey, if you want butterflies and moths, we also have to provide food for the larvae. And in this case, that's a willow that the larvae is feeding on. Then they go through their pupal stage. This is where they undergo this really, really radical metamorphosis. Where they go through all this activity. They seal themselves up into the cocoon or chrysalis, and then emerge out as the adult butterfly or moth. Mm-hmm. And again, no matter how many times you witness this, you just have to be enthralled with it. And so in that adult stage, which is often the shortest part of their lifespan, they spend most of their time really in their larval stage. but we enjoy them as an adult, which that phase might only last, in the case of a cecropia moth, maybe a few days to a week or two. And at this point, they are actually so stout and have so much protein built up, they don't really do any feeding at that point, but they're just out there. That's when they're looking for a mate, so the species can continue. So that's what we call a complete metamorphosis, where it goes through all 4 stages of development, from the egg to the larvae to the pupa to the adult. And moths and butterflies are the classic example of that.
That was beautiful.
Yeah, but then it's really, like I said, it's the adult, the butterflies, that are out there searching for the nectar, searching for a mate, and giving us so much enjoyment in the garden.
Right, and it's interesting that that's the shortest stage of life for them, you know, that it's not that long. But they're very, you know, these are tiger swallowtails on zinnias, which is another composite, another daisy, and they just love them, and they'll just cluster on there like you wouldn't believe.
Yeah, and again, that shows you that long mouth part, that proboscis, that's designed to reach down into those tubular flowers and grab the nectar. And that is our state butterfly, I believe.
Ah, interesting.
Yeah. So we're talking, giving just a few examples. In this next picture, you'll find what is commonly called the parsley worm, and a lot of times people would find this, here it's feeding on dill. You'll find this feeding on plants that are in the carrot family, and you might be herbs in your garden. But as I said, if you're going to have butterflies, you also are going to need to have caterpillars, and we actually want to find these in there. And my feeling is, with growing these fresh herbs, just plant extra so there's enough for everybody.
Yeah, you do almost have to plant them for both of you. I get these on my dill, I mean my fennel. I get them on my fennel every year. I have fennel, which is perennial, which is nice, so then I get, you know, I see these every year on my fennel.
Yeah, fennel, dill, parsley. I think it's important to actually, I try and include these plants all the time, partially for my enjoyment, but just as much for the larvae that's in there. Now the next picture, actually, this is the larval stage of the, we're looking at the swallowtail, but this next picture is the larval stage of the monarch. And they feed primarily on plants in the milkweed family. It's kind of, again, this neat example of how nature works, because milkweed exudes this toxic sap. The larvae sort of contains that in its skin, and then it's giving that warning sign saying to the birds, hey, you don't want to mess with me, you know, I'm going to taste pretty nasty. But then that larvae develops into this gorgeous butterfly.
Right, and that's really part of the issue with our decline in monarchs, is that they're so host specific. They only need Asclepias plants. So, you know, we've seen a huge surge of people trying to plant Asclepias for the monarchs, and it's nice to find that people are sort of listening and trying to help support the monarchs.
And it's such an interesting butterfly. I think it captures our imagination because it does migrate.
Right, all the way to Mexico.
Down to Mexico for the winter time, then comes back here for the summer. It's just really, really fascinating. And then this is a viceroy, which looks almost identical to the monarch, but I put in there as a good example in nature what we call mimicry, because the monarch butterfly, it contains the alkaloids from the Asclepias plant, so that it's distasteful to birds, which are the primary predator there. Now the viceroy is actually a tasty morsel, but by disguising itself as a monarch, it tries to avoid predators that are out there. And again, this is a lot, even through my experience in my own career in horticulture and gardening. You know, we're lured into this, I think, by the flowers. But the more you investigate, the more you learn just how fascinating the whole ecology works.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, we'll go through. I think we might have, I'm trying to remember if we have another example of this.
The pipevine.
Yeah, the pipevine swallowtail, which really, to me, re-emphasizes the point that Karen was making about how host-specific these larvae are. Because the pipevine swallowtail, it doesn't have the choice. It can't go feed on milkweed. You know, it can't go feed on, you know, the dill or the fennel or the parsley we were talking about. Its food is the pipevine. It doesn't have that that wide of a food range. So that's why we have to maintain diversity in our gardens, our landscapes, and our natural environments, because this is the larvae, this kind of weird looking caterpillar.
Yeah.
But look at what it turns into. Just gorgeous.
Mm-hmm.
So if we want to have these visiting our gardens, and we do, we have to provide the plants for them, is really the message that's in there. And I'll show one more picture here before we take a break, because it is about the plants, but you'll also sometimes see butterflies landing in puddles, or in this case on a damp picnic table. And what they're doing is they're getting essential salts, the things that they can't get from the nectar, the nutrients they can't get from the pollen. They do pick some of these minerals and nutrients up off the ground. You'll see them on rocks. In this case, a wet table is there. And what's that? That's the zebra swallowtail.
Zebra-striped swallowtail,
Yeah.
which you don't see very often.
You don't. And they
We're
don't
gonna
stand
talk
still
about them
too
in a
often.
minute.
They
No,
jump
move
around quite a bit.
fast. Yes.
Great. Again, we're being interrupted with these annoying commercials,
Yes.
but that's
here we
what
go.
pays the bill. So here we go. Stick with us, and we'll see you in a couple minutes.
So we hope that you've learned through this whole program a lot about what you need to do to bring these great, pollinators in. One of them, of course, is specific plants that we've talked about, because different color flowers, different shaped flowers bring in different pollinators. But we also want to emphasize that some of them are very specific and need just very specific plants in order to survive. So you put things out like Asclepias or pipevine for those specific pollinators. As far as pesticide use, be very careful. You don't want to use many pesticides. What I always tell people is, if you think you have an insect problem, then you need to know what it is. You need to understand what it is. And sometimes the insect problem, be it aphids, are taking care of themselves. There might be some, wasp, predatory, parasitic wasps, things that balance, the problem. And so you almost need to know that in order to stop from using your pesticides and understand that it's all being taken care of. You plant specific plants like parsley, fennel, dill, to bring these great, wonderful, some of these great butterflies in. And then we're going to finish with a few lovely photographs still of plants that they really do like. This is perennial eupatorium, or Joe Pye weed. And it's very interesting when you grow this native in your garden, because as it comes into flower, from bud stage to flower stage, you'll see this, at first no butterflies, nothing going on, and then all of a sudden it's like nectar, pollen, everything's happening. The flowers are ripe or open, and all of a sudden the butterflies are there, from morning till evening. And it's just loaded with butterflies. So Eupatorium or Joe Pye weed is a wonderful native plant that you should put in your garden if you want butterflies. Blooming right now. We have them at Merrifield. They come in different sizes. Everything from a dwarf, which still is 5 feet, to your standard, which can be 8 feet tall. And they like a moist place, but they're great for the butterflies. And then we did look at the zebra-striped swallowtail earlier. One of the plants it really likes, and it's interesting, these feed, their host plant is the pawpaw tree. So we don't see quite as many zebra-striped swallowtails here as we do, say, in West Virginia, where they have a lot more pawpaws. But people are, again, responding to that and planting more and more pawpaws. But as far as nectar goes, lilies are one of butterflies' favorite plants, and they will reach up with the proboscis into the interior of the flower and gather or drink the nectar. And then as they're doing that, they sort of have this interesting movement of their wings, which picks up pollen. And I've seen butterflies that were so covered in pollen from lilies that they're almost brown. And that's just amazing to me, because then they move, and it's clear that as they move from flower to flower, that they're passing that pollen along that they picked up on their wings, which is all in response to the way that they hung onto the flower and drank the nectar. And if we look once again at the composites, or the daisies, here you can actually see the way the rotation is of the small flowers as they open up inside, and they come along and they sip and they drink as the flower ripens. And that's sort of the smart thing about composites. They're actually considered the smartest flower as on the evolutionary tree, because they do this for such a long time, those little tiny flowers opening as it spirals into the center. And then the big petals, which are just there to sort of lure in the pollinators and attract them. So this is typical of what you see for a flower that's pollinated by butterflies. And here we have echinacea in the garden, yarrow in the garden, phlox in the garden. And sometimes when people come to Merrifield and they ask me, you know, what should I plant for the butterflies? I tell them just follow them around. Just look where they are at the nursery, and it becomes quite immediate, you know, which flowers they like. But you do absolutely, positively have to put in, you know, the larval source, the host of foods that they need in order to really make sure that they're going to be there.
Yeah, and this is so critical because we talk about through loss of habitat, you know, monoculture, agriculture practices, you know, even, you know, pesticide use stuff. These pollinators, I mean, they're stressed. Their numbers are in decline.
Right.
And that's why Karen and I are trying to get everybody to sort of open your mind up and share your garden. It's really not for us. I mean, the gardener has to enjoy it, but we're part of a very important food chain and a larger responsibility in just our enjoyment.
Yeah, and the more you learn, the more you find that it's just fascinating.
Exactly. And like I say, a lot of times we get just as much enjoyment out of seeing all these insects out there as well. So
yeah.
That's one of the things I wanted to emphasize too at the Merrifield Garden Center. We do have professionals. So if you find things in your garden, bring it in. We want to identify, right, is this as a pest? Is it beneficial? Is it just a nuisance? Yeah. And get educated and informed before you jump into taking action.
Right. Know what it is.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Karen. This has been great. And Karen's going to be back with us next week as we talk about flowers in the late summer garden. One of her favorites, dahlias, will be featured.
Yes. We're going to learn all about dahlias.
Great. So we'll see you next week.